Hello, everyone, and welcome to Detroiters Speak, Making Labor Work. I am Carolyn Baker. I'm with the General Baker Institute, and tonight's moderator is David Goldberg, and I will pass it right over to Dave.
Thank you, Carolyn. Glad to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming. This is our third session of our series, Making Labor Work. Today we're focusing on organizing, let me check the name so I don't get it wrong. Organizing beyond the auto workers. So we're really looking at kind of like earlier conceptions of unionism prior to business unionism, quite frankly. And we're lucky to have an esteemed group of panelists that I'll introduce shortly. Detroiters Speak, for those of you aware, is a community classroom organized by a team of folks, Baker Institute in Detroit, the Department of African American Studies at Wayne State University that I'm a part of and won't be retiring from for my students who may have heard otherwise somehow, as well as the University of Michigan's Semester in Detroit program. Additional sponsors and supporters of this series include the Michigan Mellon Project on the Egalitarian Metropolis, the U of M Detroit Center, and the American Association of University Professors, Local 6075 of the American Federation of Teachers. I'm David Goldberg. I'm an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State, as well as a member of the General Baker Institute's board of directors. I'm also a proud member and council rep in the AAUP Local 6075 of the AFT at Wayne State Faculty and Staff Union. Tonight's session is entitled Organizing Beyond the Auto Worker, and it examines what some people refer to as whole worker or social movement or social unionism, its decline and subsequent attempts to revive it within the United Auto Workers of the UAW. To frame tonight's session, I think we should take several central ideas or questions from our title and from our prior sessions. So first, when we say organizing beyond the auto worker, we're referring to the radical origins of auto worker unionization, or the UAW, eventually, when industrial unions, building upon the precedent set by groups like the Knights of Labor and the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, made no distinctions between the shop floor where workers work and the communities and struggles that workers inhabited outside of the factory and the shop floor. Moreover, as General Baker reminded us in the video we watched in the first session, we need to conceptualize labor more expansively and recognize that labor includes anyone and everyone struggling to survive in our capitalist society. Those who are employed formally and informally, the underemployed, the unemployed, those able to work, and those unable to work, etc. As we'll learn tonight, this is how the radicals who helped build the UAW conceptualized industrial labor when organizing the union in the 1930s. But this vision and breadth of vision was subsequently sacrificed by Walter Reuther and others in favor of business or bread and butter unionism, as some call it, which ultimately led to the decline of union power and organized labor in this country. Second, to reiterate a point made by Craig last week, and I want to interject here. Craig's going through it right now, he and his family, and I just want to give a special shout out to Craig and his family. We love you all, and we're thinking about you. Craig noted by suggesting that we need to make labor work in our series title, that is, we need to construct a multidimensional and multifaceted labor and working class politics. We are clearly also pointing in the title to the reality that labor hasn't been working, or at least not as well as we think it could or must be working. General Baker's life and legacy once again brings to light many historic struggles to make labor work, as he spent much of his life fighting hard to change his own union and to challenge it, the UAW, whether it was earlier through Drum and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, or later as a member of Local 600. He fought endemic racism and sexism within the union. He fought against bureaucratic or business unionism, and he fought for his union and all unions to do more for the communities where workers lived, both in the United States as well as the workers of the world. And of course, at the heart of his political project was challenging capital in the auto industry, but also globally. Finally, the word beyond in the title for this week suggests that in order to change the labor movement for the better, to make it more powerful so that it can fight for the interests of everyday people en masse, this requires a reconceptualization of the size, scope, and tactics of the labor movement. In other words, we, and here the big we, that is everybody, who is forced to sell their labor in order to survive in this world, must be involved. We need to make labor work, whether industrial labor or otherwise. More rank and file working people and non-working people must assert our control and power over the labor movement by fighting to disentangle unions from the Democratic Party and entrenched union bureaucracy. Doing so requires vision, solidarity, and organizing our power both within and beyond the confines of the labor movement as we seek to build a viable and more extensive labor movement and working class politics. Tonight's speakers are going to help all of us learn more about that radical vision and trajectory that informed early auto organizing in Detroit, so we can learn from the past to build power and a better world shaped by the majority working people in the future. So with these very preliminary framing remarks, let me introduce our format for this evening. And I'm going to steal from Craig here because I really liked what he did last week. And I'm going to liberate his format for our third session. Like last week, we'll start with more of a news talk show format as he conceptualized it. That is, I'll have two basic questions I'll pose to our speakers. And I ask for short 2 minute or so, 2 to 3 minute answers from each of you. And I hope you all will engage with each other's answers and respond to one another as we do that. After going through those two questions, for about 20 to 30 minutes. Then we will hear each speaker share more in-depth reports, about 10 minutes each, on their current organizing campaigns, historical projects, and perspectives. And then afterwards, around 8:15, we'll open up the Zoom room and YouTube live stream for what I believe will be a very robust discussion. So to do that, I ask all of you, whether you're in YouTube land or on Zoom, as we go to, pose your questions as you come up with them, and we'll be keeping track of them and try to get to as many of them as possible at the end of the session. So now let's get to it. I'll introduce our three speakers for the evening, and then I'll pose the first of my two shorter discussion questions. First, we have Diane Feely. Diane is an auto worker from American Axle, UAW Local 235, and was an active campaigner against the two-tier wage contract voted down in her local. When GM and Chrysler were being bailed out during the 2008-2009 economic recession, as a member of the auto worker caravan, she called for Washington not to impose concessions on auto workers, but to use the moment to build a mass transportation system. Last year, she campaigned for the successful one member, one vote campaign in the UAW referendum for electing top officers. She is also active in Detroit eviction defense, which originally defended homeowners against foreclosures, but which is now, as Detroit has become a city of renters, more involved in supporting tenants. She is also involved in the reproductive rights group of Michigan, which I believe she'll tell us about a organizing effort they have coming up, which is organizing a reproductive rights event on International Women's Day at Wayne State University. She is also an editor of Against the Current. And if you're not familiar with Against the Current, I suggest you look it up and read through it when you get a chance. And I could send out that link in the chat later. Next, we have Brian Yap, who is the Director of Programs and Operations of the Motor Cities National Heritage Area, an affiliate of the National Park Service dedicated to preserving, interpreting, and promoting the automotive and labor heritage of the state of Michigan. Having been born and raised in Detroit, Brian has always been surrounded by the rich heritage of Southeast Michigan and enjoys the opportunity to connect the stories across the region. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Brian's going to talk at length about the hunger strike and Ford hunger strike. And as many of my students know, we've already discussed this in class, and hopefully we'll get even more background on that tonight. And finally, we have Steve Nafke, who works at the Ford F-150 plant and is an active member of UAW Local 600 and sits on the union's leadership council. Steve has been working with other union members to reestablish unemployed councils in the union, something I believe he'll discuss at length tonight. He supported the One Worker, One Vote campaign and has been active in the Michigan branch of the National Poor People's Campaign, which is led by Reverend Barber and Liz Theo Harris. Steve is also a longtime friend and comrade of General Baker and Marion Kramer. And Marion asked me to tell me to thank Steve's son for the pie that he made for her recently. All right, so with the pie thanks already given, now let's get this conversation going with my first question to the panelists. And we'll start in the order, we'll work in the order that I kind of introduced you. Okay, so Diane, Brian, and then Steve. About 2 to 3 minutes each, if you would. So here's the first question. Each of you have experience with auto worker organizing or the history thereof, the UAW and labor more broadly defined. From your perspective, what role can and should the UAW and organized auto workers play in the struggle to revitalize and radicalize the labor movement and social justice struggles today?
So I came up with 5 different points I want to make in this 2 minutes. Number one, we should oppose two-tier wages and benefits. These are sort of individual solutions that the corporations try to get us to support rather than the group unity that we need as a union to make changes. Second thing I would say is we need to build an anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, and pro-immigrant culture in the union. We need to come together. The third thing is we need to be present in struggles both at the workplace and in the community. And that includes community issues like adequate housing and water rights. It also includes very important issues like voting rights, as well as international issues. All of them are one sort of ball of wax. I think we also have to help organize the unorganized, since the union only represents 10% of the working population. And I think we especially have to organize the parts plants. This creates the network through which we get to the assembly plants. And I worked in 2 different plants, and one of them was a parts plant. This is part of a strategy. And the last thing I want to mention is a strategy. We need a strategy to organize and to think about ourselves. For example, we have climate change, and auto production is one of the big problems that we face in terms of CO2. It's like 1/3 is because of transportation. So we need to develop a strategy for dealing with climate change. And for me, that means we have to go from the individual car society that we have now to a mass transportation society, where is really good quality and free mass transportation. So we can be the trendsetter in developing climate justice rather than the drag on the economy that we currently are. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Diane. Brian, I know you're not active organizer or anything like that, but just touching on kind of your knowledge of this history, what elements, when you look back on the labor movement, do you kind of reflect upon and take your lessons from as moments in time in which wide groups of working people, whether in the factories or not, deeply benefited from unionization?
Sure. Yeah, and I was going to touch on that in the second question as well, but I like to describe it as labor adjacent. I mean, we are a group that supports the history and the legacy of the labor movement, and it certainly resonates and rings true with everything we talk about with the legacy of automotive labor side by side with that, and it's recognized as our affiliation with the National Park Service notes that in our legislation, it says you will recognize both the contributions of automotive manufacturers and the contributions of labor, in particular the UAW. So it is of national significance, as we all know. But I guess my perspective on it is to not be complacent in well-doing, that UAW has faced challenges and struggles since the very beginning, and has always shown the ability to rally, particularly on the local level. I mean, I don't know, as you said, I'm not an organizer. I'm not I've not been part of a union, and I'm an outsider as far as that goes, but I don't understand sort of the highest levels. But in our interactions with UAW in particular, there's inherent human capacity on that local leadership. In my role, the director of programs, I've been able to conduct interviews and sit down with many of the UAW leaders for our Many Voices One Story program. So I talked to President Roy Gamble, and then President Roy Gamble last year, and current Vice President Cindy Estrada, for instance, talked about their roots, and it comes from organizing, it comes from service, and their perspective is still rooted in that when it comes down to it, despite sort of the red tape and the bureaucracy, it comes down to service to their members and making sure the members are organized and galvanized. What reminded me even more so last year, I talked to President Mike Welter, who is the president of Lansing Local 602, and he talked about being as inspired today as he was 20 years ago. So I just, kind of compel them to think about not being complacent, not to settle into status quo, and not stop, never to stop challenging sort of what can and should be done for the people. Think about focus on showing a new generation what it means to lead and to give back. This is critically important that we don't get in a position where they get tied up in bureaucracy and people's titles and positions, but talk about what they should be doing to set up the next leaders. And I know generally speaking, the system is set up for that, so that you are handing the baton off to the next person. But sometimes you can get bogged down. And then Diane said on the social justice front, I mean, it seems to me that in the studies from the very beginning, even before the beginning, we want to talk about the hunger march a little later in 32. So when UAW forms in 35, it seems like they've always been hand in hand with issues of social justice and issues of radical change in communities all the way up to where we are today. So whether it was in the 30s, coming out of the Great Depression, or the 40s coming out of World War II, or the 60s, as Walter Reuther stood with Dr. King, in Detroit and in Washington, D.C., or today talking about voters' rights or D15, that sort of thing, that they've been right there side by side. So I say, focus on that, focus on being able to stand up for rights for all people, and the union being representative of that.
Steve, what would you like to add?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I appreciate being invited to the panel. I worked in the engine plant, not the F-150 plant. And I say that because I'm not as tired as the people who work in the 150 plant. I originally came out of the old Dearborn assembly plant, and I remember walking in the first day, and at the first break, I saw three of the people that I had hired in with, and they're walking out. I go, "Hey, what are you going?" He says, "I can't do this. This is too hard." And it is hard, but when you have two kids at home, you don't have much choice. So that's just the way it is. Again, I think the comments by the two previous speakers are very, very important. I want to just touch on a couple of things. One of them is that I think I come out of Local 600, and we have a history and a tradition. And I think there's a book called Talking Union. It's an oral history of Local 600. And I would suggest that anybody that's interested in not the real history, that aspect of the history, read the book. The previous speaker mentioned about civil rights. Well, it's important to understand that Rosa Parks first came to Detroit at the invite of Local 600, and she wasn't invited by the International, but it was Local 600 and their commitment to social justice that brought her there. And so I think we have that tradition. If you walk through the halls of our local, you'll see a mural of Paul Robeson. You'll see a mural on the halls of the Leave No One Behind, which is recently put up there honoring, working for getting the veterans who have been deported, immigrant veterans deported. They'll be on our walls. We have a mural going up on the Ford Hunger March. So we're very active in these things. And I think that we reflect the times, because it's been a difficult time in the last 10, 15 years. So, but I do think our local is starting to step up again, and there's things we're doing. I would say in regards to what the UAW is fighting is that this two-tier is a major issue throughout the economy. I mean, the strikes that were held at Kellogg, at Warrior Met Coal, which is still going on down in Birmingham, or down in Alabama, the John Deere strike. These were all based on two-tier. And like Diane said, it's an effort to split workers. That's all it is. And we fought for years and years to unite workers on all kinds of ways, and this is what the company did. And the company took advantage of a downturn in the economy to do this. And so I'm not going to get into all the ins and outs of some of this, but it was a huge mistake. Everybody knew it. And that was what the last strike at General Motors was all about. And we at Ford were itching to go out. And Rory Gamble was our Ford leader. And we were promised, I shouldn't say promised, that's too strong. We thought we would be going out. I was elected as a picket captain. We were set to go, because there was a militancy and an anger towards the company that the workers wanted to express. And if our local adopted a couple of the picket lines, and we brought, and our break rooms were filled with diapers and food supplies and stuff like that. People supported it. So I think the concept of unity and solidarity is very much alive within the UAW. The last 2 points I'd want to make is that I think that on the social justice front, the importance of passing legislation that opposes this voter suppression. It's a direct attack on our democracy, and I think it's something that the trade union movement is involved in and needs to kind of move forward. So let me stop there, and I appreciate being part of this.
Before I move on, does anyone want to respond to Steve or add some thoughts based on anything you heard? All right, I'll keep it moving. To the point, before I ask the second question, just to the point of the need for mass transportation, right? There was an unfortunate vote recently, I think it was the other day, in the suburbs of northern Oakland County, I believe it is, right?
Auburn Hills, I think.
Auburn Hills, which opted out of, SIMTA. And of course, we have, we're one of the few cities in this country which, because of deep-seated racism and classism, right, where we don't have a regional transportation network that is, for years you couldn't catch a bus from Detroit to Livonia, for example, and that's a problem. And that's something that, of course, separates groups of working people from one another, and of course exacerbates problems long existing. All right, let me get to the second question here, if I could find it. All right, I'm looking at my document. Where is that? Okay. All right, let me see. I think I'm looking at somebody else wrote on the document. Okay, what aspects of auto worker and union history, and this is kind of pertaining to the question I erroneously asked Brian previously, do you think can inform contemporary organizing efforts? That is, what previous examples should we emulate, and what must we avoid to begin to turn the tide, to go from, having a union movement, particularly in auto, but beyond that too, that, we see the numbers constricting. Less and less of the American population is under the union banner, particularly in private industry. We've seen an outgrowth of kind of like, walkouts and wildcats in this last year that doubled from the previous year, right? So there's labor militancy clearly, but how do we expand it beyond just the workplace, and how do we grow the presence in the workplace as well? And Diane, I'll start with you.
So I was thinking about this question and how I wanted to go back to the question of two-tier, and how even written into the UAW Constitution is the idea that we want to bring up the wages and working conditions so that we're all equal. And then I thought, especially because Brian is here, I thought about a 1938 strike in Detroit, very close to where I live, Federal Screw on McGraw and Otis Streets in Southwest Detroit. And they had 350 workers. The majority of the workforce were Polish women who lived in the neighborhood, and the job setters, that is, the guys who had paid more, were mainly German and Irish guys. So they actually, the UAW had a contract there. And in 1938, there was a dip in the economy and a recession. And so Federal Screw took advantage of that. And they say, well, we're going to lay off people and we're going to cut the wages. So 200 workers were laid off. And they said, we're going to have a 20% wage cut. And one day people came in and then unilaterally, the company cut wages 10 cents an hour. And the union committee was prepared, and their organizer, Stanley Novak, a wonderful, wonderful organizer, were prepared, and they went out on strike. That was on a Monday. By Wednesday, they had all their ducks in a row because they knew that the company was going to bring scabs in, as they were, and those job setters were going to go to work. And by Wednesday, they had between 3,000 and 5,000 picketers marching in front of the plant, accompanied by the union car with the sound system, which was operated by Victor Reuther. And there were 600 cops that came out, many of them members of the Black Legion or the Ku Klux Klan. And there was a huge fight, physical fight, between the picketers, which constituted the flying squadron from the West Side, unionists from other plants, Kelsley, Hayes, Dodge. Oh, I thought you were telling me I had to stop. No, okay. I thought, oh, I haven't even told my story yet. Okay, so at any rate, on Wednesday there was this huge confrontation. And a lot of people got injured in that fight, but the union was ready for it, and they packed the city council meeting, and they forced the company to get rid of the cops and actually close the plant down and negotiate with the UAW. And at the end of that, the wages stayed the same. The seniority and overtime schedule was increased, and the UAW became the sole collective bargaining unit. And that, I think, is true because the UAW prepared itself to go into battle and had told a story about why it deserved wages that weren't cut. And that had a big impact not only on Federal Screw, which was a small company, but who did Federal Screw send their materials to? Ford and General Motors. So it also had an impact on softening up in preparation for the organizing drive that was to continue. So I think this is a grand lesson.
Mhm. Anyone else want to add to that or add your own contribution?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that amen to Diane's point about respecting and recognizing the history of it. You know, that these are the sorts of moments we learn from that were successful, right? You know, that you engaged in all this and was successful and built a foundation for even greater success down the road. These aren't sort of one-time flame ups. These are progressive steps, you know, towards a bigger goal. And I think that's perspective you have. And if you don't mind, I'll, you know, transition into, unless Steve, you want to chime on that too, but I'll go into my little points on this as well.
Well, just two things on, was kind of responding to Diane. Stanley Novak was a great guy, and he was started off as a UAW organizer, and he was trying to organize the Rouge, and there was a huge contingent of Polish workers at the Rouge, and so they couldn't speak to them. So what he did was he decided to run for state senator, but he didn't expect to win. He wasn't running to win. He was running to use the platform to organize the Polish workers into the UAW. And he told me one time, he says, Steve, I never expected to win, but he did. And he became a state senator for 10 years or so. But he got into it exactly like that. He brought the community into the struggle for the union. And that's what I think is the history of the UAW and its success in its earlier days. The second example is the Flint sit-down strike, where the work, and these were young workers. They sat down and they controlled the plant. And when the company tried to bring in water cannons and guns, also they responded. And then what they did was the union then opened up a second strike, unbeknownst in a kind of a secretive way. They expanded the strike, and so that really, in all honesty, that sit-down strike that set the stage for the CIO, and it was a rank and file militancy of younger workers. I happen to know a friend of mine, Shirley Foster, who passed away about 10, 15 years ago. Her husband was one of those sit-down. He was like 28 years old. And that's, I think, one of the things about these strikes is there were a lot of young people, but it was the ability to connect to the community. Because in Flint, they had a huge right-wing force up there, but the union fought and fought to build the community support. They brought in a chef from Detroit to cook all their meals. They did all these kinds of things that brought the whole community together. And that, I think, again, it's a legacy, and it's not just the legacy, it's the path that we need to follow this time. It's what got us here, and we need to continue to do it. Yes.
All right. So with that, I'd like to move forward, but before I do, I just want to add one thing, because we're talking about kind of like lessons from the past, and I'd be remiss if I didn't discuss a little bit about Drum and the League and General Baker, right? I think, there was a commitment to civil rights within the UAW under Walter Reuther to a degree on a national basis. But I think, what workers were very concerned with in the 1960s, particularly young Black workers entering the plant, was the conditions that they faced, in plants with largely, Black people working on the line and white supervision. And they really demanded of their union a greater and playing an active role, which they weren't playing, responding to their grievances, things of this nature. And I think it's important for us to conceptualize, not just within auto work, but within all society, the importance of leadership from below. I mean, I think that's, at the origins and the heart of Local 600, is that there was a very active rank and file in that union, but it was also a leadership that was responsive to that rank and file, something that kind of became abandoned later on. And the importance of kind of like the worker self-activity to kind of propel kind of radicalism within the labor movement forward. And of course, this brought us things like OSHA and worker safety provisions, and Black people gaining access to skilled trades and things of that nature, which were very important at that time in the 60s. I wanted to mention that in part because I had my students reading a little bit about that today. But I would also argue that those two, when we're looking at the 30s and the 40s and even the 60s, these are interconnected kind of like legacies, right? So I know we're going to talk a bit about the Hunger March later. Famously, Dave Moore for years was the last living member to, be active in the Hunger March. And, when General got heat for going to Ford under the assumed name Big Al Ware or Alexander Ware, it was Dave Moore who came back into the union after being red baited, right? That out by Reuther, who protected and defended General's claim. And that gets to kind of, I think, some of the power of repression too, because in many ways, Jen wasn't really familiar with these old stories about, Black radicals in the union. And some of those kind of connections were torn asunder by the Red Scare, right? And he started to learn more about that. And that's the importance, I think, of what Diane was saying about carrying the story forward and having a story to transmit from generation to generation, right? So with that, I'll turn back to Diane and allow you to your more extended time, and I'll sit back and listen anxiously.
Let me just start by saying, there are lots of different methods that were used in organizing. The sit-downs that Steve mentioned, the strike and the massive picket line that I mentioned. Another tactic that was used, brought in to the union by Stanley Novak, was work to rule. And the first time work to rule was used in America was at the Turnstad plant, which was at one point the largest parts plant in the world, 13,000 people, mostly women, majority women, right down there on Fort Street. I think we also need to be innovative in our community work too. For me, production and reproduction, it's all part of the same. We're producing the next generation, and we're also now as an older person passing the torch on to the newer generation. So when I was working at American Axle, I did a child care survey as part of the Women's Committee. And it was really interesting to me. I tried to interview everybody, male and female, who cared for children or grandchildren under the age of 18. And I found incredible stories about the heroism of my co-workers who got to work on time, but were really traumatized by what they had to go through, all the hoops that they had to go through to be able to get there on that line and to be able to leave. Some of them had to go and pick up disabled children, for example. So I really learned a lot about, how these issues aren't just far and away. After I retired from American Axle, there was a strike, and many unions and members of the committee turned out, community organizations turned out every day to that picket line. And there was a labor notes conference in town at one point, and people from all over the world, Japanese, Germans, and so forth. And I organized a contingent to go over on our lunch hour. We had a bus and several cars. People on the picket line cried to hear that this person from Japan or this person from France cared enough about them to come to the picket line. So these are the ties that we can build. Everywhere I go in Detroit, I meet my coworkers. And when I was leafleting last fall around One Member, One Vote, the referendum that we had and won, and I was up at the Warren stamping plant, I met the next generation of workers whose dads and moms were bringing them to work and were people that worked in my plant. So everywhere I go. Particularly since Occupy, I've been involved in Detroit Eviction Defense, which came out of Occupy. And we're basically a direct action group. There are lots of different people who do different aspects of helping people on housing, but we're more the direct action component. So when people are being evicted, and actually the court has signed the document, we often get called in. And so one of the things that we do is go to the house and wait. For 60 days, the bailiff has to come and put a dumpster in front of the house. And if we wait and prevent that dumpster from coming, they can't evict the person. So we've done that in a number of cases and, have been successful in many. And so that's sort of how we developed our beginning tactic, which we still do. That means we have to go from 8 in the morning till 5 at night, 5 days a week, to be able to prevent that dumpster. We've developed a whole bunch of tactics that I wanted to talk about. We have mass call-ins to mortgages or banks. Flagstaff, for example, was calling in a mortgage. They have 23 banks that are mostly in the suburbs. We went to 21 of them and brought letters and asked to speak to their manager. Please tell your corporate headquarters that we don't want this person evicted. We held picket lines on Saturday mornings when the bank was open. We went to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who are government institutions, but call in evictions. We even organized a car caravan to Chicago, which is where the Fannie Mae office is for this region. And we got in touch with the teachers union in Chicago and with a UAW local right there. In fact, they brought us lunch, and there were some steel workers who were in town doing some corporate campaign work. So we all got together and marched to the Fannie Mae office. They had a fit and wouldn't allow us in. We thought we could go in because it was a public building, but actually it's owned by some private corporation. They just rent. But before we were back in Detroit, we got a call from Texas, from Fannie Mae, to deal with the problem. So the main thing that we're trying to do is to force the institution to listen to the people who are being evicted and prevent the evictions. And we've been able to involve Steve's Local 600 in a number of those campaigns, as well as the AFT at Wayne State. There's a bank center right there. So sometimes when we have to go to the bank center, we ask the Wayne State folks to come as well. We also leaflet with community organizations. There are a lot of block clubs in Detroit, and we work with them to help get the information out. We've also done a lot around the CARES Act. A lot of money was given in the course of the pandemic to both state and local governments to cover rent and even utilities, and significant amounts of rent, up to a year's rent. So getting that information out was important. In fact, last fall, we leafleted over 3,000 people and had lawyers come to a park in Detroit. We couldn't go inside a meeting, so we had them come to a park. We had tents at the park, and people could come and get advice from the United Community Housing, which is a very good housing group, and Lakeshore Legal Housing. So we work with other groups, and we have a coalitional approach. So we discovered that that landlords do a lot of evicting. They don't necessarily go through the courts. They're supposed to go through the courts, but they intimidate people. And about a little over a year ago, this landlord, sleazy landlord, called the cops to come and help him. And 3 cops from the 10th precinct went and helped just before Christmas evict this woman and her kids from this house. That's an illegal eviction. So we organized a couple of marches on the 10th precinct. And in fact, that woman has now filed a case, which I think is a very good case, because this is absolutely against police practice. And so they were violating their own rules, and we can prove it with videos and other materials. But I was standing right next to when a police officer said, "We do not evict people." And I realized, how can she say that when we know that they're evicting people? And then I realized, oh, they don't think people who don't have a contract are illegal, and therefore they can be evicted. Actually, this woman did have a contract, so it wasn't like she was illegally squatting. But they think of squatters as non-humans. No, that's not the approach that we take. Everyone is a human, and everyone has the right to housing and to adequate housing. And this is, of course, one of the problems. We don't have adequate housing in Detroit, and we don't have the kind of capacity to help people stay in their homes. And during the mortgage crisis, we also had a tax crisis when the price of the house went down, but they were not reevaluated. And so people paid too much on their taxes. It's now estimated that at least $600 million extra was paid to the city, and people lost their homes because of that. So now we have a land bank which has a great deal of houses and other property in the city. And we don't feel that they're really very responsive to individual homeowners or potential homeowners. There are lots of rules that you have to jump through. And they prefer to, work out deals with larger investors than to deal with the one-by-one case. So we have our problems with the land bank as well. So we've developed a whole number of tactics that we use. And the point is that a lot of these rules are rules that discriminate. And who do they discriminate against? They discriminate against Detroiters, which means Black Detroiters, right? And so we want to change this situation and force the government to be responsive, and force the banks to be responsive, and force the mortgage companies to be responsive, and to force those who should be inspecting the homes adequately to give a fair assessment. We also don't have any rent control in the city of Detroit. And we're now working with a guy who in their apartment unit, they raised the rent $200 a month. Who can afford a rent increase of $200 a month? I mean, that's just impossible. Well, that company, it's in Midtown, and they want to get rid of those renters. They'd much rather have a more gentrified crowd. So we really need to think about protecting the people who have lived through all of the problems of Detroit. They shouldn't just be thrown out because, some people can pay a lot more rent. Okay, I could go on and on about Detroit eviction defense, but I just want to switch and say, one other thing is I want to say 36th District Court. This is where evictions end up in. And before the pandemic, there were 10,000 evictions every year. Now they went down because of the moratorium, and there were only about, I think, 950 last year, but they're going up again because, of course, there's no moratorium. And because even though there's money under the CARES Act, people aren't getting it. So more and more people are being thrown out of their homes. One of the things that we said that 36th Court and the city of Detroit should do is make sure that everybody who goes into court, every tenant who goes into court, has a lawyer. Because if people have a lawyer, they have a fighting chance. And other cities like New York and San Francisco and so forth have found out that actually it's a savings for the city when people are afforded the opportunity, since they can, they don't have to rely on some of the emergency grants that are given out. So there's a possibility that with the new city council, we may be able to get lawyers for every person, every tenant who goes into court who doesn't have a lawyer. And that, of course, would be a big step forward. Although the big step forward is really affordable housing that's also quality housing. So then I just wanted to say, am I going over my time?
You have a minute or two, but yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So I just want to say that because of the crisis around reproductive rights, where the Supreme Court is going to rule either to overturn Roe v. Wade or to limit it, I think probably they'll limit it because the majority opinion is that there should be abortion rights. And so we have a small group, reproductive rights group of Michigan, and we've been having some demonstrations and other activities. And since people are here from Wayne State, I wanted to be sure that you knew that there's going to be an event on International Women's Day, which will be Tuesday, March 8th. At noon, we're going to have a chalk-in on the mall, and you can come and chalk about your feelings or your slogans or your stories. And then at 1 o'clock, we're going to go to the auditorium in the undergraduate library. Well, there'll be a panel discussion. We also have been in touch with the ACLU, who is putting together a petition to put a referendum on the ballot to put in the state constitution the right of reproductive freedom. So we'll have that available too. So I hope that many of you will come on March 8th. And hopefully, I saw one question in the chat about safety, and either Steve or I can talk a lot about the UAW and safety. While I was at American Axle, 7 or 8 people were actually killed on the job. And so safety is a huge issue, even today, after even though we do have a very good health and safety law, making sure that it's followed and implemented is still a problem. And every year there is one day where we come together and remember those who were killed in the course of the last year. And so maybe we can talk more about that.
Yes, thank you, Diane. I'll say just on that last point, it makes me think of something that I remember reading in Detroit at I Do Mind Dying, and they talk about the number of injuries and deaths caused by auto production in the 60s, and they compare it to soldiers injured at Vietnam. And there were more injuries and deaths in auto plants than there were, U.S. soldiers injured or killed in Vietnam over like a series of years in the mid 60s, which is quite telling. I'm going to hand it over to Brian, but before I do, Detroit Eviction Defense is a wonderful group, and I encourage people to look it up and get involved if you'd like to, make your mark in helping people who are struggling with the housing crisis. But it emanates from a strategy deployed by the Communist Party in Detroit in the 30s, right? And I think Steve's going to talk about more, but I think it's important for us to learn from history, know that you can't repeat it exactly. I always say, people say history, you can't repeat it, but it rhymes. So how do you take tactics and strategies, militant tactics and strategies used in the past, and then kind of gear them and kind of remake them for your given situation? Right. And I think that's an important thing for us to consider. And while we're going back and thinking about kind of these early tactics and strategies of people trying to organize auto, it's a good time to go to Brian, who's going to talk about the Hunger March, right, which is another example of kind of these early tactics and strategies.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, David. That setup makes perfect sense. Like you say, you don't want to repeat history. You don't want another battle of the overpass. You don't want ugly moments and things that happen that put a black eye, but they also prove a point. Someone in the chat said sometimes history is violent, which is true. I mean, many of the things we recognize as key moments in history have to do with wars and rumors of war and even tensions that we're building up right now. So we understand that does happen, but you might want to look at situations like a Flint sit-down strike, as was mentioned, or even a Lansing labor holiday. If you've not heard of that, look it up. It was a one-day sort of general strike in Lansing that is also recognized as being very significant in that same window of time. These were formative years in the 30s and 40s, pre-UAW. UAW forms in 35, and say something like the Battle of the Overpass in 37, or the Flint sit-down strike and others after that. Go back and look at that history. And in fact, one of the points I was going to make earlier is maybe it feels like we all, and especially in the union, have to find a way to make that history as direct and relevant as possible, because if it's not being taught, if it's not being passed along, if you're in a position where you can choose to know, but you don't have to know, then it leaves you sort of in the dark on the relevance of some of these stories. Steve working at Local 600, someone asked me the other day my personal history in the story, and I was able to meet Bernie Rickey, sit down with him. And if you've ever met Bernie, the president of the Local, he's amazing wealth of information and history about that place and can tell you the stories. And he took me on the tour down the famed hallowed halls of Local 600. And boy, you get the whole picture of it when you start from the beginning and work your way all the way around to today. And that feels like that should be 101 for anyone joining and saying they want to be part of labor leadership. I told you when I interviewed Mike Huerta, he said the same thing when he started to go into labor leadership and training. It was the history that he was most interested in, not even though he had to learn the negotiating and the tactics, the history really set the foundation. So and then in my own life, I'm a product of all of this. My father worked for the city of Detroit for 40 years, and he, even today, when we're talking about simple concessions that come around that seem simple to us, he says it was not given, it was negotiated, that somebody had to fight for this, for you to have another day off of work, for you to have a 5-day work week, for you to have 40 hours in a day. And I think people take that for 40 hours in a week. I think people take that for granted and don't necessarily understand because you don't have to anymore that you would. If it weren't for that influence, my life would be different. And I recognize that both of my grandfathers worked in auto in the classic sort of Great Migration trend of coming from the South here in the plants. And my dad's father in particular talked about wanting to be in tool and die at the Rouge plant. He was at Ford, but wanted to move up the ladder. And if it were not for the influence and support of the union, it certainly never would have happened. And so it meant both. It wasn't just the company that provided for him; it was the union that had to support him to create the sort of the class standard that he chose to live with. So it hits personally when you talk about the importance of it. And as an outsider, one of the things I wish I could do is toot the horn more often. I think sometimes you get challenged within the bubble of not being able to tell your story as much as you should, because when you do it, then it feels self-aggrandizing. You talk about how great you are, but when you don't say anything, then people only pick out the negative. You hear about controversies and setbacks and corruption and that sort of thing, as opposed to hearing about all that has been happening, over the last, for UAW at least 87 years, that has been generally positive and been influential on a day-to-day basis. So think about the people, on the company side of it, and that'd be great. So with all that preamble out of the way, David, you said the Hunger March, and you mentioned that you'd already discussed it. So we're not gonna, it's not a history lesson today because I'm not the person to do that, but I am a person that organizes efforts around recognizing that history and celebrating it. And so we start off here with this, one of the famed images of the rallying at the Hunger March, March 7th, 1932. This is, right near the crossover between Detroit and Dearborn. The Rouge plant is just a half a mile down the road there. So they're getting ready to march, and they had a list of demands they were going to present to Ford, because coming off the Great Depression, it was, hunger was a relevant term in the sense that people were struggling for everything, particularly jobs, but, equal pay and concern about community support. And this was what, I knew of when Motor Cities became involved in this project in 2012. This marker stood on the, or was affixed to the 4th Street Bridge that crossed over between Detroit and Dearborn. So this bridge, again, you're looking at it from the Detroit side. Sorry, the Dearborn side. So you're looking at it from the Dearborn side as you cross over. And the sign that was affixed to it, we were told that because MDOT had to rebuild the bridge, that the sign was going to go. And that seemed an unconscionable loss to us to not have a marker there that told the story of what happened at this site. And unfortunately, there are rules about historic site signage says it is at this site that this thing happened. And because the site will be greatly changed, that the sign could not stand any longer, it was going to be taken down along with the bridge. And in fact, Steve, they said that the sign needed to be destroyed per Michigan state laws. Well, what happened was we all went to bat on that, including MDLT, but primarily it was Local 600 again. And Bernie, who wrote that letter and made sure that didn't happen. And fast forward to the headline on that, the sign is now affixed to Local 600 as a tribute to what happened there. So it was because of that process and the people who fought for it that made sure that the story was not forgotten, even in that interim moment, because it would have been. But the story of the Hunger March was, at this space. And so it was Motor Cities and a group of community partners that sort of had to galvanize and rally around this point. And we are part of a group called the Fort Rouge Gateway Partnership, or FROG. And we had a concept of what this space could have been. When they tore down the bridge, MDOT also owned the park that was next to the bridge, the space that was next to it. And we said, well, what if that space weren't just a parking lot or weren't just a gravel pit, but was a park? And so, to borrow an automotive phrase, we started talking about the concept, like a concept car. We started talking about the concept of a park in this space in Southwest Detroit that told the story of what happened here, that told the story of community and industry meeting together here, and of course, nature being a part of it right on the banks of the Rouge River. So it was this confluence of these three major elements meeting in this one space. We always intended to have interpretive signage, recreational space, and we always intended to use elements from the original bridge that was torn down to make this park. So again, to borrow an automotive phrase, to go from concept to reality, this is the park today. So this is the new bridge, as you see in the upper right-hand corner, has been, and it's in itself is a mechanical marvel. It is impressive, but it's not the old bridge. But the new bridge has been affixed there, and then the park sits there on the banks of the river, and right in the middle is a statue, a monument to, I'll talk about a little later, but those are original parts and gears from the bridge that were torn down. And we'll see more about the park as we go along. But the concept to reality was wrapped around these partners as part of this Frog group. And the Frog Gateway Partnership covers this footprint that you see on the screen. So kind of roughly from the mouth of the mouth of the Detroit River, sort of down the Rouge through Dearborn. You see Ford sort of sketched out over here, but as you go along through Dearborn into sort of downtown Dearborn and near the Henry Ford and down past even the Ford estate. So it kind of covers that span. And their mission is to sort of focus on things that enhance the watershed and the footprint around the Rouge River. So you can see the footprint there a little more expanded. And I won't go deep in that. But here's a photo of the partners as we opened the park in October of 2020. So again, a diverse mix, including UAW, Local 600 representatives right in the middle there. In fact, recently retired, I understand Reggie Osborne, right? He's out of there, but he was right there in the center of all of this when we cut the ribbon. I'll talk about that in a second too. But I want to show you a few more elements of the park. At the park, there are some interpretive signs that talk about, as I said, the history of the Rouge River, so the connection of nature to this space, blue and green waterways, and how this little spot is a connector to a broader connection of blue and green waterways around the state on the Iron Belt Trail. So this is where Governor Snyder laid this out, but continues on the Iron Belt Trail to connect greenways and give people recreation and non-motorized travel across the waterways. And it did not exist across the river at this same point. So now the park has become an important node in that connector. And right across the street from the park is actually the trailhead for that connection. So as you cross 4th Street there, you're continuing on and actually run into this trailhead that leads you down to the Detroit Greenway to the Downriver Link Greenway. So it shows you how it's all connected beginning there. But the park was actually the genesis for that. Stormwater was a big part of this. When we talk about, again, being right next to the river, talk about the urban water cycle. And we all understand that the auto industry has done its share of damage to environment, but it also has been working very hard to change its carbon footprint. So there's a story there about stormwater management, how the park is an example of that. Water drains down, pours pavement, and is filtered through and back into the river. And we hope to continue to expand that footprint. And you see some example of that. There's actually a fountain and actuated by this little button and these little playful frogs that spit water out onto the porous pavement. It drains down through this tribune and down out into the Rouge River in the back. So we're actually sort of functioning there, and kids get a great kick out of that. And some big kids, some adults get a good kick out of that as well. But of course, the Hunger March was the center of it for us. We, as an automotive and labor history organization, wanted to make sure that we told the story here of what happened, of the 14 demands are listed here. The images of the marchers and the violence that erupted, are there, and it's all recognized and captured in this moment. The stories, but when you get a chance and you're at the park, especially, take it all in. You can imagine someone who did not know and stumbled upon this little oasis, and they walk up and read this plaque and understand exactly what happened in the space. So, we see images here of those who marched across. There's that same watchtower as they marched across on their way to Ford. We know what happened. They were met with, let's say, resistance, Ford security, Dearborn police, violence ensued, and gunshots, fired. We know the tragic end to that, as it was covered, 4 died in the riot. It actually ultimately became 5. And, we mourn those. So we see the images here of the funeral and their interment at Woodmere Cemetery. So we know what was lost. We know what was at stake there. And that stayed on our minds the entire time that we were working to create this park. This image here is from Local 600. Again, actually, we were there for the Michigan Labor History Society. If you're not a part of that or aware of that, look that up and learn more about what the society does to promote the legacy and the history of. But this image is of a family, the name tag gives it away, but I'll tell the story anyway. This image is of a family who, when we said we were going to build this park, and I'm there, got good news coverage and articles went out, and we started a crowdfunding campaign. And the first donation came in, and it was from this family, and I gave them a call to thank them for their support. And a gentleman picked up the phone, and it was a young lady whose name was on there. I said I was looking for her. He said, "Oh no, she's at work. Well, what is this all about?" I said, "Well, she made a donation to a project, a park that we're working on, and I just wanted to, say thank you. We appreciate your support, and get into it." And he said, "Well, I know a little bit about that." And he started telling the story. The gentleman is the gentleman who's in this picture. His name is Joel Bustle. And for those who know the story of the Hunger March, there were 5 who died. And one of the 5 people who died was named Joe Bustle. Joe Bustle was this gentleman's uncle. He had passed away, and he was shot and killed that day, just a kid, really. And he was named after his uncle. You know, when he was born a couple of years later, his mother, Joel's sister, named him Joel in tribute to his brother. So for 80 years, he had waited, you know, wanting to have an opportunity to have that story told, wanting an opportunity to be recognized and honored. And you get into the story of the Hunger March, and you know, you talk about you know, the controversies associated with it. But it's stories like this and people like this that kept us going forward to make sure that the park was realized. So that's Joel, his daughter, and his wife. And we kept them abreast along the entire process because we knew when the moment came to cut the ribbon, we wanted them to be involved. So we fast forward here, the young lady in the middle, standing next to Bernie Rickey, Local 600, standing next to Bernie, holding the big scissors. That is Elena Bustle Shelf. That is Joel's daughter. That is the great niece of Joe Bustle. Unfortunately, Joel passed away just 2 weeks after this park was open. But his daughter shared with them the stories of being there that day and sort of the celebration that came along with it. And for them to be in the middle of that sort of galvanizes. There was a lot of hows we built the park. There was a lot of permits and fundraising and, you know, that sort of thing. But the why always remained that we wanted to do it for the people, wanted to do it for the people like this, whose story needed to be told, very specifically a story of Joe Bustle and those who passed away. So as we cut the ribbon there, we dedicated it to that memory of those who died. You know, tell a quick story about the salvaging of the materials. This is at the Fort Rouge plant, actually. They stored the materials for us for a couple of years before we were able to build the sculpture. And then a local Southwest Detroit artist, the Detroit Design Group, Eric and Israel Nordine, you know, forged this, took these parts and forged this sign and sort of took our concept and made it a reality. You know, and this video kind of hovers over it, but the statue using the truss from the bridge and the gear in the middle sort of represents that reach and that stretch towards you know, something greater. There are 14 lattices in between here that represent the 14 demands that were presented that day. And there are some spears affixed to it that represent those who marched together as a cohesive unit that marched, you know, in a group. So the statue represents that, and the statue was aptly titled "March On." So the statue's title was "March On," and on the statue was affixed a plaque dedicated to the memory of Joe Bustle and Joe De Blasio, Coleman Linney, and Curtis Williams, and Joe York, the 5 who passed away, in the spirit of those who have braved hardship, who have stood in the face of and you know, lost their lives, that the Ford unionization came off of their backs. Wages began to rise because of their march. Detroiters got a better life. And that's the spirit of the 4th Street Bridge Park and the dedication to the Hunger March. On the other side of the statue, there is a placard dedicated to the river and its resurgence as well, to talk about the spirit and effervescence of those who march on in the face of environmental strife as well. So keep those 2 things in mind. And I think I just made time, David. We are wrapped up, but I wanted to get that story out there. That is the story of the 4th Street Bridge Park.
Great, Brian. I appreciate it. We'll go to let Steve do his thing, and then later, if you guys have comments about, you know, whatever was presented, I'd like to have a little give and take. But Steve?
Yeah, when I was asked by Carolyn to speak, she talked specifically about some of the history of the unemployed councils, and that's kind of what I want to talk about in their connection today. And I think the history of unemployed councils is an important part of our history, and it's reverberated today. I think and I'll go into a little bit more, like Diane talked about the eviction issues. But the unemployed councils were initiated in the 1930s as a response to the Great Depression, and the hunger and the evictions and everything that was going on at the time. And it was put together by, you know, groupings of different people, mostly socialists and communists that came together, like Carl Border and socialist Carl Border in Chicago. In Seattle, there was the Unemployed Citizens League. A.J. Musty in small towns in Ohio and Pennsylvania organized unemployed groupings. But the largest was the unemployed councils that were organized and starting in 1930, July 4th, a convention in Chicago of over 1,300 delegates. And it was backed by a variety of people, but included the Communist Party, the Young Communist League, and the Trade Union Educational League. Trade Union Unity League. And this was a left formation within the trade union movement, because you have to remember at the time, the CIO had not yet been organized. There was no UAW, no steel workers, no mass production industries with the exception of coal that existed. And so it was more smaller groupings of unions. But the local unemployed councils were set up in cities all over the country. And besides unemployed, the movement included trade unionists, fraternal societies, language societies, which were very big in those days, African-American organizations, and many other sympathetic groups. And the councils fought for unemployment insurance, for immediate cash and work relief, public work at union wages, food for school children, against evictions, and against discrimination and racism, and a number of those things. And they used the mass meetings, parades, petitions, picketing, marches, and many other forms of agitation and struggle. And they formed block committees to put together workers, to defend workers in their homes. One of the tactics was if a block club knew that someone was being evicted and the furniture would be put out on the street, then they would hang out, organize, put themselves together, and they put the furniture back. And the sheriffs would come and say, all right, you can't do that. And we said, okay, we know. And they put the furniture back on the street, furniture would be back inside. They trained themselves how to turn the power back on when the companies cut the electricity. So and you had a lot of unemployed electricians at that time, and so they knew what they were doing. And they did all these kinds of things to mainly to make sure that people's lives were not made any worse than they already were. But one of the big issues was organizing for unemployment insurance relief. And this was headed by a guy named Louis Weinstock, who was from the Painters Union out of New York City. And and to this day, the Painters Union is one of the most progressive building trades unions in the country. But they argued and campaigned hard for the workers' unemployment insurance bill. Because at that time, there was no Social Security, there was no unemployment. If you got laid off, you were on your own. And this is what they fought for. And it's important to understand that this movement everybody associates Social Security with FDR. And that's true. He signed the bill. But he didn't sign it. He may have signed it, but he was pushed to sign it by millions and millions of people organizing and going on in the streets, in the kind of street heat that we talked about. And one of the big ways that the unemployment groups worked was through these hunger marches. And they were all over the country. And, Brian talked about that. I just want to add a couple things about the hunger march that are kind of personal for me, because in 1992, there was a 30th anniversary of the Hunger March. And that's when that plaque that Brian talked about was put together. And there were still a number of hunger marches that were alive then. And they came to the thing, and two in particular that I remember. And Dave Moore's name was mentioned. And the two that I know specifically were Dave Moore and Chris Alston. Dave Moore and Chris Alston, 145 pounds apiece at best. Two of the toughest SOBs you'd ever want to meet. But they were 18, 19 years old. That's how old they were. Chris Alston was 3 feet from one Joe Bussell, who was only 16 years old when he was killed. He was standing right in the front, and that's when he was shot and killed. He was right there. And the other four that were killed, the names were mentioned. And the fourth that's interesting, Curtis Williams was African-American, and they would not allow him to be buried in that cemetery. So 30 years ago, and what they did was that he was cremated, and there's 4 or 5 different stories, but the idea was that his ashes were then flown over the Rouge and fled out through over the Rouge. I don't know, I couldn't verify that, but it's a good story, so I'm sticking to it. But the thing is that this is what the Hunger March did. Now, Dave Moore was 18 years old. He said later on in a video that he made for the history of UAW 600 that this was the turning point in his life. He said from that point on, his life changed, and that he would dedicate himself to the interests of the working class and to build up the people that he worked with. And he always spoke fondly of Local 600. Now, Dave went on to be an organizer for 600. He helped organize the union when it came in 41. He was elected to leadership in the local. During the Cold War, he was blacklisted from participating in leadership. Walter Reuther and the others, there was 4 of them that were kicked out and told they could not run for office. 9 years after Dave was blacklisted, he'd been in the motor plant. He was reelected on 30 days' notice, reelected to the same position he had 9 years earlier, and that was because Dave never quit. He didn't give up on the union. He didn't, go in the pout and cry. He never stopped fighting. So he went on to be elected to the executive board of the local. He was an international rep, and as you said, when General Baker was fired from Ford, it was Dave Moore lined up against 5 different attorneys from the company that defended and won General Benner's case. He went on to do he was an assistant to George Crockett for a long time also. Chris Alston was someone who I also knew, and I just tremendous fond memories of him. Chris also was 19 years old. As I said, he was in the front of the line when the shots fired, and he knew all 4 of the ones that were killed. I don't know if he knew Curtis, but his wife said that he did know all 4 of the other ones. They were all together. And Chris went on to go down south as a CIO organizer. He worked for the tobacco workers in Virginia and Tennessee. Then he went on. He came back up to Detroit and wrote a pamphlet called "The Negro Worker and the Ford Motor Company," and it was a crucially important pamphlet that connected to because Henry Ford had tried to make this campaign to divide the workers. He and Charles Hill were 2 of the people that really helped put build that unity together. Chris went on to be an organizer for Local 600. If you walk through those halls, Dave and Chris's pictures are both on the walls there. Chris is there with John Conyers Sr. at an organizing meeting. Chris then went on to be elected president first of all, he was on the bargaining committee at Packard Local 191. Well, he was agitating for the rights of Black women there, and the company found out about it, and they worked with the military to get him put back into the service. He had an exemption, and so he spent the rest of World War II in the Aleutian Islands for his efforts. He came back and was elected president of Local 492. Again, Chris never ever quit. He was a community organizer. But I say this because the Hunger March brought thousands in Detroit. It was about 3,000 people. But these are the people that went on to organize the unions. And this was true of the unemployment councils throughout the country. They provided the CIO with experienced organizers, young, experienced militant organizers. And, it continued on, throughout those periods. And it's another discussion, but it was the Cold War that broke that unity within the CIO, the left and center unity. But it also broke the connection between the communities. And I think that's one of the things when you look at some of the books around the politics of the Cold War era, that's what comes through. And that's what I think is starting to come back again. I want to bring this kind of jump forward to right now. And that's where I think the Poor People's Campaign it brings that back together. And it shows that there's the ability of labor and community to work together. That's when progress is made. And I just want to end with just really 2 points. One is I was on the national call a few weeks ago with Reverend Barber, and he talked about the fact that we may lose an election. We may lose a vote in Congress. We may lose Supreme Court decisions. None of that affects us because we're about building the movement. And it's the movement that we build that will, in the long run, win these things. And that's what I think the history of the unemployment councils, the history of the hunger marches, the history of the struggles of the trade union movement throughout history has shown us. Don't look at the short term, look at the long term. Understand that progress will be made with this continuous struggle. And that, I think, is the essence of what the unemployed councils, the hunger marchers, really they gave to us. And I think lastly, I want to just say that these were populated by younger people. Yeah, Dave Moore, I knew Dave Moore when he was in his 70s, but Dave Moore was 18 years old. Chris was 19 years old. They were without fear, and there was millions of people across this country that were in that same. They were upset, and I think that's what we see today. I think we're seeing a younger generation of coming together. I look at my own kids. When the Iraqi war took place, my oldest son walked out of high school. He led a walk. He was only a freshman. Now, granted, it didn't take much for him to cut class. But nonetheless, it was a political statement that he made, and it was a political statement to walk out of class. My middle boy got involved in organizing with the Poor People's Campaign right out of college, and now he's a union organizer and a strategist with the union is the 32BJ. And my daughter went to college, and within the first 2 months of college, she had been to demonstrations opposing the nomination of Kavanaugh. she was in Chicago, and she was going to demonstrations on picket lines for the hotel and restaurant workers. She had been more demonstrations in her first 2 months in college than I had been my whole 4 years there. So this is a generation that is understanding that if they don't do something, just like that generation of the 30s and 40s, if they don't do something, their lives are going to be in serious trouble. And in many ways, the stakes are higher because the climate control issue is oversees everything. And I think that's, to me, the hope. You know, I do my best to help out. You know, I certainly never quitting, but my hope is that we see this generation, and we see it with younger workers in the plants. You see it in these strikes that go on. You know, the Warrior Met strike, the coal miners that are on strike, the John Deere. These are expressions of people being fed up and going and wanting to do something. And to me, that's the lesson that we take from the unemployed councils, from the labor movement of the 30s and 40s. And yes, there's challenges, but there's hope. And I think that that's how I read history. It's not something in the past. How can I take that history and how does it inspire us? And I think for younger people reading history, if you know nothing about it, come down on March 5th, because we're recreating the Hunger March on March 5th down at the local center. Now, there won't be guns and fire hoses, fortunately, but everything else will be pretty much the same. But we're going to meet, we're going to march, and then we're going to have speakers at the local 600. And come through that local hall, walk through our hall, look at those pictures. I'll be around there if anybody wants to. I'll be able to explain some things. But yeah, that's it right there. And there'll be other speakers that are going to be there also. But it's an important celebration of a struggle that has continued and continues to go on. And you'll see pictures of posters that were made from the 30 years ago when we made the strike. So I appreciate being invited to speak, and I appreciate all the other speakers. It's been a very pleasurable time for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all of you. I just want to see if anyone wanted to reflect or remark on any comments you heard before, anything you wanted to add before we move on to questions from the audience.
I just wanted to say something about the unemployed councils, unemployed leagues. They had different names and different political organizations. But I remember that when the Toledo Auto Light strike took place, one of the things that A.J. Musty, who was a leader of the unemployed movement, said is that this was all training for when the economy recovered and people were back in the plant. This was where the leadership of the next wave of unionization is going to come from. So learning how to be leaders and organizers is really key, because you have to have a strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll say too, just about Musty, Musty went on and inspired scores of people that are later directly involved in the civil rights movement, right? So it's not like these struggles were bifurcated, as was mentioned. That was kind of a result of the pressures of the Cold War, but Shachtmanites and Mustyites were throughout the civil rights movement, as well as the Socialist Party and Communist Party and various different groupings, right?
And he was leader in the anti-war movement.
Oh,
I mean, the coalition that he was able to put together because of his authoritative presence really meant we had a broad anti-Vietnam War committee.
Oh, I always use the example of the journey of reconciliation, right? In the sense that it then moved into and informed later struggles, right? And that's really, I think, what you all are getting at about how to learn from history and get some hope, and as well as a strategy, as Diane's mentioned a couple of times, very important, tactics and strategies and learning from that. Anyone else want to chime in? All right, let's start to take some questions. I saw some good ones before, and there's a link. Brian put in a link for the event, I believe, the recreation of the march. So if you want to click on that and download it or grab a copy for yourself, I'm just going to go from the bottom here. This is Jeremy Ritz. What does one do when things get too dire? Like when there are too many injuries or things become too violent? And this, of course, applies to what we've been talking about. Like, yeah, how do you overcome kind of the repression that invariably workers' movements face?
Well, you get up the next day and you start again. I actually thought that long question was about health and safety on the job. And actually out of OSHA and the health and safety committees that have been set up, we actually have improved the situation in auto, although as I mentioned, there were 7 deaths in my plant in the period of time at American Axle that I worked there, and 1 woman was scalped. You may think of scalping as something that happened in the 19th century, but she was scalped on my shift and we had to deal with that. And she lost her hair, but at least she didn't lose her life or her ears. And when she sued the company, well, when she sued the manufacturer, it turned out that the manufacturer had been running it at the wrong speed. It was too high. So it cost her hair, which was really beautiful, but I think we won something out of that. How do you deal with I mean, I think you have to be more specific about the violence that you face in your own plant. I mean, we've had nooses left on Black workers' areas. How do we deal with that? We come together and we reject that. Or are you talking about something else? You know, so there are many different situations in which you're involved with that you try to think out. How can you win the best unity possible to defeat the right-wing tactics? For example, I went out of work one night and these guys are standing around trying to collect signatures about the UAW had in our contract that gay couples could have partner rights. This is before the Supreme Court decision that allowed gay people to get married. Okay. And they were organizing against that in our contract. And they were appealing to women saying, well, you know, you're with your partner, but you don't have those rights because you're not gay. This is special privileges. So here I come out and I had to deal with that. So I think, okay, when one group gets something, we don't want to take that away. We want the other group to have it too. And so I talked about that and they said, oh yeah. So they didn't sign the petition. The people went away. So, you know, there are all these different fights that you're involved with.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Well, I'm like Diane. I would maybe ask the questioner to clarify a little bit, because it feels like from the context of the question, they're asking about violence as resistance to some of these stances and you know, social, you know, stances, which someone else even answered that you would hope that things will remain peaceful. You know, that's the thing. When I mentioned you don't want to go back to Battle of the Overpass sort of things and you know, things that are overtly violent. But at the same time, you know, you got to make some noise and get in some good trouble, if you will, to make some differences there. So I'm not sure if that's the question about when it becomes too dire, you know, maybe more specifics about in this day and age, you know, how are things becoming too dire for, you know, this specific person.
Steve, you want to chime in?
The only thing I'd say is that in terms of kind of again, I'm not 100% sure, but if the question is talking about kind of the personal situation when these things get down and you're involved in this, I think the best way to do is understand that you're in this struggle together, and you got that. What it really makes you do is look for the people that you're involved with in terms of political struggle, because that's where you're going to get your support. And yes, there is going to be it's tough situations. You're going to lose a lot of battles, but you don't give up. And that's, I think, one of the things that Reverend Barber always talks about, is that you don't give up. Giving up isn't going to make it better. And especially once you know something, and you know right from wrong, and you know something is wrong, you can't ignore it. And if you do ignore it, you're going to find yourself in a tougher situation. So the only thing in trying to answer the question, I think that when things get difficult, and you need to be able to find a collective group that you're a part of, whether it's a block club, whether it's a union committee, whatever. That's where your source of drinks is going to come from.
Yeah, I would add to that, and just to give a book source, because someone is asking for that. There's a good book on organizing in Detroit as well as in Windsor by a friend of mine, Jeremy Malloy. It's called Blood, Sweat, and Fear. And what's important about this book is it makes you reconceptualize the notion of violence, right? In fact, unions are formed to deal with the violence of the industrial process, right? And the exploitation of their labor, right? Which is in itself an act of violence, right? So in many ways, that violence brings people together in solidarity to demand their rights within that system, right? And I think that's important to note, to have a more expansive kind of understanding of violence and its impact on labor organizing. It's a response to that very violence. I have a long question for you, so bear with me. And excuse me if I mispronounce your name, I apologize. Zehao Tong, to everybody. Industrial workers' bargaining power has been systematically ripped away from their hands under the neoliberal international division of labor regime since the 1980s. Under such context, the industrial workers' demands for higher pay, better working conditions, etc., seem inseparable from anti-globalization, anti-immigration tendencies, because the tradable goods industry, unlike certain sectors of the service industry, can always outsource their production to some developing countries with less legal restrictions or lower average income to reduce the cost. There are also always fresh supplies of immigrants into the US to have their labor exploited for less compensation. How then should the modern left cope with this situation and form meaningful broad coalitions without betraying its aspiration for international solidarity and equality? That's a long one and a very complex one, but go ahead, take a crack at it and see if you can figure that out in a minute or two.
Well, let me just, one thing I would respond. Part of the question is a recognition of how capitalism has developed. And when we talk about the loss of industrial power in this country, industrial unions, it's a combination of things. The neoliberal trade laws, it really began back with Richard Nixon. If you look, there's a book called The Pivotal Decade, and it describes how finance capital is essentially taken over industrial capital in the way they work and the change of laws. So industrialization in this country switched both through trade laws, but also through automation. I mean, I worked on a crankshaft line now I work on a block job line, and we have 9 people on our day shift team. There used to be 25, and 30 years ago there was 45. But as automation changed, and the work is much easier. And when you talk about work in the 60s, it was so dangerous because the automation was not there. Everything was done by hand. Wheels went on. You put tires and wheels on by hand. Well, that's hard. I guarantee you that's hard. And so, but that was true throughout the system. So as automation changed, the jobs actually became safer. But the thing is that what UAW has recognized, that changing of jobs doesn't have to mean loss of jobs. It has to mean a different way of working. But the trade laws were a big reason for that. And that was, those are one of the reasons we've lost. To get back to it, I think that it's a combination of recognizing that as industry develops, those new jobs have to come under the focus of the trade union movement. For example, the battery plants that are being built around the country, they need to be UAW. When batteries goes into cars, essentially they're replacing engines. So every engine plant that's going to be shut down because of the battery, they need to have that work on those batteries. And that's what the UAW is out trying to do. And there's actually more jobs available with the new electrical cars and everything going on than there are now, even though you're going to no longer see, different kinds of systems that, exhaust systems won't be there. But it's actually possible. At the last UAW convention, the research director talked about the need to organize the new facilities to bring the industrial power back. And key to all that is the passage of the PRO Act. One of the things that we can talk about is the passage of the PRO Act, which would eliminate right to work, would change dramatically the ability of unions to organize. And, for the last 50 years, the National Labor Relations Act has been decimated, and this would begin to turn it around. So that's one of the things that we can talk about in terms of legislation, but also unions have to find a way to organize these non-union facilities. That's a short part of it.
I would say we have to examine the supply line. For a period of time, the companies wanted to bring the parts plants into the union, so into the company. GM wanted to have all of its parts plants, and Ford. Now they decided, no, we're going to get rid of them because we can have greater control over them and not pay the pensions and so forth. So that so the two-tierization isn't just of workers, it's also of the company. So what's really necessary is to trace that whole supply line. Where are all of those parts coming from into the assembly plant? All of that. And, it used to be that parts plants were pretty well organized. Maybe they made a little bit less than the workers at the assembly plant, but that's no longer true. 90% of the parts plants are now unorganized. So it seems to me that's where you begin. Now, frankly, I think Amazon is really difficult to organize. But when people talk about how difficult the work is there, it reminds me so much of my work at American Axle or at Ford when I worked at the assembly plant in New Jersey. So I know that it can be done, although it's a massive undertaking, and it's not going to be done by one union. It's going to be done by a number of unions coming from different points of view. Right now, there's huge upsurge among coffee workers. I mean, the Great Lakes Coffee Company workers are on strike right now. You can go down to the picket line at 1475 East Jefferson. And Starbucks is also, those workers are beginning to organize. We don't see it out there yet. They're still doing it internally. So there's a huge opportunities. Not all of them, of course, will be successful, but the ones that will be most successful are the ones where people are organizing inside the plant or inside their office, and they're beginning to act like a union before they have a contract. And maybe they'll never get a contract, but they'll still act like a union. So I think that's really important. Okay, the other part is, of course, the borders. We unions go across borders. And it's really important. When I went to Mexico, for instance, I tried to make contact with some of the Mexican workers there. When I went to China, I really had ambitions to try to go to the American Axle plant in China, but not knowing the language, not even being able to read a street sign, I realized that I was out of my depths on that one. But there are, of course, union to union opportunities to organize, and it's very important for us never to take one of these narrow nationalist points of view. There is enough work in this world that needs to be done so that we all can do it. And I'm also for getting rid of overtime and reducing the work week, because why should we be working a 60 or 80 hour work? I mean, I first started, I had a 50-hour work week followed by a 58-hour work week. you know, we need to be working 30 hours a week or 20 hours a week so that we can do some other things. And there's plenty of work that can be done as we reorganize the world, because it's tremendously unequal now, and we need to work at making it a more equitable society. So borders are not important for unions.
I just want to say how good that 30-hour work week is sounding right now, Diana. I got the next question. Kiara Broom, not so much philosophical, just wondering what's out there. A, what are some labor history books or media you all might recommend, specific to Michigan or not? And then B, what is the state, and let's just focus on councils here for the sake of brevity, of like things like unemployed councils today in this area in Detroit, in the metropolitan area.
Well, there's a lot of wonderful books about Detroit and labor, and I think one of the best is the one, David, you might be able to help me. The one that Steve Babson and some of the others. That's the picture book.
Working
so you can
Detroit.
actually
Working Detroit is
Working Detroit. Yes, that's a great book to start with, because you can actually, you know, go to all these places and see them. Or
shout out to Steve Babson too, who works with Detroit Eviction Defense as well.
Yeah. We have an oral history of Local 600. It's called Talking Union. And it was written about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, but it really gives the history of how the union was organized and different relationships, different political viewpoints that were going on in the union at the time. Two other books are on the Flint sit-down strike. One is called Heroes of Untold Story, and the second is called The Many and the Few. And both of them go into great detail about the sit-down strike as well as the history of the union in that era. And if you're at all interested in a general labor history book, Labor's Untold Story is really kind of the starting point for many people in terms of looking at the history of the labor movement. It's a really good book. It ends, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, but it's a good history up to a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
I like also Stanley Novak's, I guess it's a biography, or maybe that his wife wrote. It's really very nice.
I just wanted to add too, there's a former student at Wayne who's coming out with a book, University of North Carolina Press, on kind of workers in the environmental justice movement in Detroit, kind of broad history that I think is very important to consider today as well. Let me get back to some more questions here. This is for anyone who wants to answer, but how do housing justice and job security, general rights and benefits intersect? Is there a larger message for what we should be working towards, and where should we begin in the fight for general prosperity for all? So I think the question is looking at kind of these housing things, sometimes that we disassociate from labor, right? With kind of like labor organizing and the bread and butter issues of contracts and what have you.
Well, I mean, they seem to intertwine in the way that Diane is, kind of really eloquently tied it all together, and that the same sorts of people who organize and think about what is for the greater good. When you come down to it, that's sort of the bottom line on this is that, the union organizers are looking at what is in the best interest of the people, the employees or the workers and their families, and by association, the community. And that's the same thing that these eviction rights folks are looking at. It's, Diane, you said, we have a housing issue, but there's availability of housing. It's the system that, that sort of has it set up in a way that the people who need it the most don't get the access to it on the level that they need to. And then you have to act, because then you can look next to it and there are 3 empty houses, a block over that nobody can get into, as you mentioned, squatters' rights and things like that. That feels kind of illogical to have to even advocate for that, but then you do, because apparently people would rather stand on what should be and put these people on the street than to say, you know, what is and allow them to stand. So it feels like this is broader tapestry of all woven together, and that everybody has this best interest of our human condition in mind, that we all are sort of helping our brother man out. And it feels like that's the core of the union movement as well, that they're doing it for the person that's standing next to them as well as themselves.
I would just say, I mean, I think the level of tension is so high in our society. I think if I lived in a society where there was healthcare that was available to everybody, it would be such a load off people's backs. So if we think about, if we had healthcare for all, if we had affordable housing, well, you know, the story of Detroit is the story of segregation. That's the story, all about everything in Detroit. It's all segregated. And if you live, if you can't live in a certain area, then that means you have to go to that, you know, an inferior school. It is such a huge situation. And if we started from the other end, okay, what do we need as human beings? We need, you know, adequate housing. We need decent food and water. We need the right to an education. We need the right to health care. We need the right to contribute to our society in a way that we can contribute. You know, whether we're disabled or whatever it is, we can make some contribution. But society isn't organized that way. And we have to fight to make it organized that way. And here we face right now this huge climate crisis. And while we face this crisis, why don't we also face the crisis of growing inequality and change those two things at the same time? Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? So I think unions have a role to play in that.
Yeah, one thing, you know, when Diane talks about the question of connecting how the climate change issue, one of the things is that 40% of the problem of the carbon release is houses that are houses and structures that are improperly insulated, and that's where lots of energy is lost. And so you're talking about how you can campaign to, you know, refurbish housing, to make housing that's available but also environmentally sound. You're doing two things, and you're improving the environment in a way that also improves people's lives. And I think that you look back at the end of World War II, when there was a housing shortage for people coming back after World War II, you know, that's where the government got involved. And that's what they have to do again, in a way that meets people's needs, as opposed to just kind of putting people in 25-story housing projects. You know, that didn't work. But there needs to be a response that both environmentally sound as well as taking care of the needs of the people. And it really truly is, you know, I guess intersectionality is the word, but it comes together. And again, I go back to the fact that I think the Poor People's Campaign right now is an organization that is most up front in bringing all these issues together. And I think that they have the Poor People's Campaign has a national march on Washington on June 18th, and they're organizing in Detroit, well, across the country, but specifically in Detroit. And this will be the first time that we have an opportunity to nationally show our strength, as opposed to a lot of these yahoos that are riding around their trucks, you know, and independent truckers and thinking they're America. Well, the real America can show up on June 18th. I think that's where an opportunity for us to begin to show that this is what America ought to be. And it does. It brings together these different issues.
Do we have any other questions? Let me see. I think we got through them. Any final thoughts before we go and before we get to collectively thank you all, because this was wonderful. Really appreciate your time tonight. Okay, yeah, Diane reiterated, and Diane, please send this to me so I could send this to all my classes.
And your union has endorsed it.
Yes, my union has endorsed it. I will endorse it. and we'll distribute it as widely as possible. And Steve, same to you for the Hunger March event. If you want to just email that to me, I'll distribute it as widely as I possibly can and share it with my union as well, which will endorse it.
If Brian could do it, he's technologically much more savvy than I am.
Yeah, I'll shoot it to you, David. But yeah, just a plug for that.
And go to the mailbox.
Yep. But yeah, we'll continue to plug that coming up here. Let everybody know too. Look out in the Detroit Free Press. I'm pretty sure this Sunday there'll be an extensive article on the Hunger March's legacy. Tom Klug has been doing some great research and might have some eye-popping revelations on some new information that even after 90 years has been dug up on the story. So stay tuned for that. And he'll also be speaking at Local 600 on March 5th. So along with all these other activities come together on that. Also, Diane's been working, you mentioned Southwest Detroit quite a bit. I'll plug here the Southwest Detroit Auto Heritage Guide, which is another element of the Motor Cities website that sort of endeavors to look at the history of that community, Detroit's oldest neighborhoods, and how this is a community that built the car, literally and figuratively, in a community that was built by the car. And so we want to talk about that in the melting pot of ethnicities. You know, somebody just mentioned, or you just mentioned, Diane, the separation and segregation, but a point in time where when the Michigan Central Depot was the Ellis Island, so to speak, of people arriving in Detroit and going to work, that there was this mixture of all these different cultures sort of right there concentrated in this area. And eventually the enclaves formed, but you know, it was an interesting period of time in the early part of the century when auto work was booming there, building up. So I'll plug that. Yeah.
In the organizing for Local 600, they had to put leaflets out in about 12 different languages. You know, and it was Polish, Ukraine, German, Russian, Ukraine, all these nationality groups were very, very progressive at the time. These were the folks that were coming over, and they were the basis for a lot of the organizing, both the CIO throughout the country, but specifically at the Rouge. And again, that's what I said with Stanley Novak. I mean, that's how he got his start. And the Polish community at that time was tremendously progressive in supporting him and supporting when the UAW won their election, it was something like 72 to, it was a slam dunk affair. There was no doubt about it. And Henry Ford had to eat his words on that when he said he never recognized the union. Well, yeah, be careful what you say.
We have that sign right in front of the local. I mean, it's one of the things you run into coming out of the parking lot is there's a sign and Henry Ford sitting right there says, "I will never recognize the union." And there we stand. So there's a power to the people message in there.
Never say never.
Yeah, and at one point, 25% of African American men in Detroit worked at Ford. So what's really weird about Ford is, yes, he was a racist, but he was a different kind of racist because he hired blacks as opposed to GM, which only hired blacks in the foundries, which that's why American Axle, was a majority black, because it was dirty work. Therefore, blacks could do it, according to GM.
Yeah.
But the corporations had their different kind of racist approaches, and really, in many ways, African Americans don't make it into a lot of plants until the 60s, which is why drum emerges.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting point. If I can divert it again, we have an entire treatment of that, making tracks, and appropriate because we're in Black History Month, making tracks is our African American experience in the auto industry that discusses just that, Diane, that whole breaking in. And we talk about the influence of someone like a Reverend Charles Hill and his role in the early days of organizing, and some of the names that you guys mentioned, your Coleman Youngs, your John Conyers, your Sheffields. I mean, these are names that people will come across and not really understand the influence they had early on and how important it was to that whole discussion. And it was not sort of just equal right off the bat. And like you said, it was different for different companies. Some people say, hey, a worker is a worker, and Ford saw it was a way to make money, then that was the way that he was going to manage his workers. So he didn't discriminate as far as that went. But no doubt there would have to have been some discrimination, as was the style at the time.
Well, just in terms of Ford, who he hired, most of the blacks went into the foundry, and that was that way for years. And in fact, when I got 28 years at Ford now, but I know up to even like 10 or 15 years ago, if you retired, you had two levels of your retirement. You had your retirement based on your forward hiring date, but you also had additional time called foundry time. So if you spent time in the foundry, for every year you worked in the foundry, you got a certain percentage of time added on to your pension because of the foundry time. And it's also interesting that, you know, the black leadership that came out of local Sun, Buddy Battles and those, they all came out of the foundries.
Yeah.
With the exception of now Rory Gamble did come out of the frame plant. I was in the frame plant, was just right after Rory left. But the blacks, they went into the foundries, and the second largest grouping in the foundries was the Polish people. Poles and blacks made up the foundry workers, and it was that unity that worked together in terms of building the union that was there. And you know, there was a lot of effort by Ford to turn the black workers against the union, and he had a bunch of ministers that he put out money to, and Charles Hill was the one that stood up and said no. You know, he stood up for the union. In fact, we still have, I think I mentioned earlier, we still have a hall in our union hall called the Charles Hill Auditorium. It's in honor of him and what he stood up for. So it's an interesting history, and it's one that's relevant today because we still see those issues. They haven't gone away, but they were overcome by kind of unity and solidarity in the struggle for a better life. And to me, that's kind of how the best of Local 600 has always been, is that unity and that struggle for a better life. We're always going to have slips and make mistakes, but if we keep our eye on that, I think we're okay.
Yeah.
I think, as you know, General used to say, the victory is in the fight, and that holds true to this day. I will say, and I'm going to end here, I just want to say thank you again. If we could all give them some Zoom applause, that'd be great. We thank you for your time. We do appreciate it. And I want to recommend, I'm going to plug one more book from a former colleague of mine, but a book called Black Detroit in the Age of Henry Ford, which talks about particularly how Black people were placed in the foundry once they abandoned Ford's paternalism and joined Local 600, right? So with that, I want to thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week, same bat time, same bat channel, and we'll be here. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Night.
And David, if you want to come by the local on March 5th, I'll look for you there and I'll walk you through our hall and our videos. And anybody else too, really would urge you all to come down to, it's 4:00 on Saturday, March 5th, and you will recreate the Hunger March, and then there'll be speakers in the auditorium. We had originally thought we would have either Stacey Abrams or Reverend Barber, but that wouldn't, they couldn't, Stacey's, she's too busy running for governor, obviously. But we'll have them another time. But please come down to that. March
you had me at Tom Klug.
There you go. Yeah. Good night, everyone.
Take
Good
care.
night.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Thank you for the invite.